It started as just a subtle hint, something seemingly insignificant, and he almost brushed it off entirely. Work had called him out of town, as it occasionally did, and as always, he left Susan, his wife, with a detailed itinerary of his plans. In return, she gave him a thorough rundown of her own schedule, a routine they had perfected over the years without even thinking about it. Early, a cheerful man known for his ever-present smile, worked as a troubleshooting specialist and negotiator for his company. While business trips weren't an everyday occurrence, they happened a few times each year. This particular trip was expected to keep him away for a week, with his return flight from Los Angeles scheduled for Saturday evening at 9:15. Since his flight would land in Seattle after midnight, he had insisted Susan not bother picking him up at the airport. He planned instead to catch a bus that would drop him at their home in Bellevue by 1:30 a.m. early Sunday morning. But plans have a way of changing unexpectedly. On Thursday morning, the deal he had been negotiating closed much sooner than anticipated. By 11 a.m., the contract was signed, and the clients had rushed off to address an urgent situation at one of their other operations on the East Coast. Early wasted no time. He caught a flight back to Los Angeles that morning and managed to change his ticket. By 1:45 p.m., he was already on his way home. During the flight, he decided to call Susan to share the news. Using the onboard phone, he tried their home number first, but she wasn't there. So, he rummaged through his briefcase to find her office number. "Jensen, Sharon, and Anderson, how may I help you?" A friendly voice answered when he called. "Oh, where's Jennifer?" Early asked. Jennifer was Susan's personal secretary, and his calls usually went straight to her desk. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Conroy's secretary isn't in the office today or tomorrow. How can I assist you?" The receptionist replied cheerfully. Okay then. Can I speak with Mrs. Conroy?" Early asked, feeling slightly unsettled by the change. "Mrs. Conroy? May I ask who's calling?" The receptionist's voice carried a trace of hesitation. "This is her husband. Please connect me," he replied firmly. There was a brief pause before the receptionist returned. "Oh, Mrs. Conroy is currently busy, and I'm not sure when she'll be available. May I take a message?" Early hesitated. Something felt off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "No, that's okay. I'll just talk to her at home tonight. Let her know I called," he said, ending the call. It wasn't until half an hour later that the source of his unease became clear. The night before, Susan had mentioned she'd be in the office all day. Maybe she'd been pulled into a client meeting or some urgent legal case. That could explain why she couldn't take his call. But Jennifer's absence stood out. Susan had a strict rule. Jennifer worked the same hours she did, unless there was some extraordinary circumstance. By the time Early's flight landed in Seattle, his mind was still churning over the oddities of that call. He arrived home at 6:35 p.m., only to find the house dark and empty. It was unusual. Susan almost always returned home by then. He unpacked his suitcase, tossing dirty clothes into the hamper before changing into something more comfortable. When 8 o'clock rolled around and Susan still hadn't arrived, he made himself a grilled cheese sandwich for dinner and settled in front of the TV. By now, he was growing increasingly uneasy. It wasn't like Susan to be this late without letting him know. Could she have been in an accident? He tried to reassure himself that if something had happened, someone would have called or left a message. Unable to sit still, he started pacing the room. When his anxiety reached a breaking point, he dialed her cell phone, only to hear the frustrating message that her number was unavailable. Why would her phone be turned off? He wondered, feeling the first real pangs of dread. What had begun as a faint hint of something wrong had become a gnawing, inescapable worry by 9:20 p.m. That's when his own cell phone rang. Picking it up, he braced himself for whatever might come next. When he answered the call and heard Susan's voice, her concern seemed genuine. "I was starting to worry that something might have happened," she began, sounding as caring as ever. "I called the hotel after dinner, and they said you'd already checked out. Is everything okay?" "Yes, everything's fine," he assured her. "The plans just changed a bit." "Where are you now?" she asked. "I'm at home," he replied, his gaze drifting to the dark, empty kitchen. The mess from his earlier cooking, dirty dishes stacked in the sink, was the only evidence of activity in the quiet house. "Oh, I just finished cleaning up here. It's so lonely tonight," she said. "Will you still be back on Sunday as planned?" "Yes, I'll be home all day Sunday." "No problem." He kept his tone even. "This morning, we moved the negotiations to the company's headquarters. You can always reach me on my cell," he added, though he already knew there was no reason to believe she tried. "Did anything out of the ordinary happen today?" he asked. "I tried calling your office this afternoon." "Nothing special," she answered a little too quickly. "I must have been on the phone with John Snur at the time. He's been helping me sort out the issues with the Melos account this week. I really owe him for that." Her tone carried an edge he couldn't quite place, something that left him uneasy. "That's good to hear," he replied cautiously. "Actually," she continued, her excitement growing, "after getting everything resolved with that account, it looks like I'm being considered for a partnership. Mr. Jensen practically promised me." Her joy seemed genuine, but it only deepened his unease. "That's wonderful, dear," he said, forcing enthusiasm. "We should celebrate. I'm sorry I wasn't there tonight to celebrate with you right away." "Don't worry, my love. We can celebrate on Sunday when you're back home. Don't be late. I miss you so much. It's so lonely here in this big bed without you," she said with a laugh that now felt hollow to him. They wrapped up the conversation after a few more minutes of small talk about household matters. When the call ended, Early sat in silence, replaying her words in his mind. The lies she had just told him were almost suffocating. His stomach churned with a bitterness he couldn't ignore. Up until that moment, he had believed in the strength of their marriage, in the love they shared. Now doubt crept in, threatening to unravel everything he had trusted. That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned in the same bed Susan had complained about being lonely without him. His mind raced with unanswered questions, and when he finally drifted off, it was fitful and brief. He woke early the next morning, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled with anxiety. By 9 a.m., he had accepted the reality that Susan wasn't coming home. He dialed her office again, but instead of asking for Jennifer, he simply inquired about Mrs. Conroy. "Mrs. Conroy is unavailable at the moment," the receptionist informed him cheerfully. "That's fine. It's not urgent. I'll call back Monday," he said, feigning nonchalance. "Oh, that should work perfectly. Mrs. Conroy will be in by 9 o'clock on Monday," the receptionist added casually. Her words confirmed his suspicions. After hanging up, Early went through Susan's work files, extracting the information he needed. He got into their dark green Explorer, a vehicle they rarely used except for camping trips or towing the trailer. It was perfect for this situation. No one they knew would recognize it. Leaving the Mercedes in the garage, he drove to Susan's office in Bellevue. As he slowly cruised through the parking lot, his heart sank. Susan's gray BMW was nowhere to be found. Determined, he headed to the address listed in her files, the home of John Snur. The house was located in a secluded, upscale neighborhood in Medina. It was surrounded by towering fir trees, and an 8-foot brick fence concealed much of the property. As he drove by slowly, his stomach tightened. There it was, Susan's BMW, parked neatly near the garage, tucked away but unmistakable. His vision blurred as emotions overwhelmed him, and he had to pull over to the side of the road to compose himself. When he felt steady enough, he drove back to Bellevue and stopped for breakfast. Sitting at a table at 11:30 a.m., he ordered Belgian waffles and tea, his stomach too unsettled for coffee. Even as the plate sat in front of him, he struggled to eat, forcing down each bite. It took him nearly an hour to finish the meal. After paying the bill, he got back in the car and returned to the road near Snur's house. Susan's car was still there. He drove aimlessly for over an hour, trying to clear his mind, but when he passed by again, her car remained in the same spot. Finally, he headed home, consumed by turmoil. The life he thought he knew, the marriage he had cherished, felt irreparably fractured. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, snacking on fruit and sipping juice, unable to muster the energy to cook. The silence of the house felt heavier than ever, a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. The only interruption that evening was a call from Susan at 9:45 p.m., just as Early was preparing to head to bed. Once again, she complained about how empty and lonely the bed felt without him. Early managed a soft chuckle, doing his best to mask his gloom. "You really don't know how lonely such a big bed can feel," he replied cryptically. Susan, clearly puzzled, pressed him. "What do you mean by that?" He waved off her question with a quick remark, agreeing that she must feel terribly lonely sleeping alone. Before hanging up, he told her, as he always did, that he loved her more than anything in the world. By midnight, he finally dragged himself to bed, though his mind refused to quiet down. The questions churned restlessly. Had she ever truly loved him? Was she punishing him for something he didn't even know he had done? No, this wasn't about him, he concluded. It was about her. But what was wrong? What more could she possibly want? Was there anything he could do to make things right again? Another sleepless night passed, filled with tossing and turning. When he woke at 8 a.m., he felt just as restless as the day before. He sat in the dim living room, curtains drawn and lights off, nursing a cup of tea in silence. It was almost 10 o'clock when he heard the familiar sound of Susan's BMW pulling into the garage. Moments later, she stepped into the kitchen, carrying a small overnight bag. From his vantage point in the large leather armchair, he watched her enter. She was dressed in a plaid skirt and a sleeveless red silk blouse with the top 2 buttons undone. Her appearance was pristine, relaxed, fresh, and composed. Around her neck hung the turquoise necklace he had gifted her for their 3rd anniversary, glinting faintly in the low light. She stopped abruptly as her eyes landed on the mess in the kitchen sink. Early hadn't bothered to tidy up after breakfast, leaving dirty dishes and glasses scattered around. Her gaze shifted to the kettle on the stove, its water still warming, and then swept cautiously around the dimly lit kitchen. Moving slowly, she walked through the dining room, her eyes scanning every shadowed corner. She stopped by the curtains covering the sliding glass doors, peeking outside briefly before tossing her overnight bag onto a chair. Without a word, she picked up the fireplace poker, holding it as though she might need to defend herself. It was only when Early raised his teacup to his lips that she noticed him. Her sharp intake of breath broke the silence. "Oh my God, Early!" she gasped, her voice trembling. "You scared me half to death. When did you get home?" He let the silence linger, the air heavy with tension. Finally, he answered, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. "A couple of days ago." Her knees buckled, and she sank into the chair across from him, her face pale with shock. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call? Where have you been staying?" He took another deliberate sip of tea before replying in a flat tone. "I did call. Thursday afternoon. You weren't home. You weren't at the office. Jennifer wasn't there either." He paused, letting the quiet stretch uncomfortably. "I was sitting right here in this chair when you called. I spent the night in that big, lonely bed you were telling me about." Outside, the sun shone brightly, and distant sounds of neighborhood life filtered through. A passing car, children arguing, a dog barking. Inside the dimly lit living room, the only other sound was Susan's muffled sobs. Taking another slow sip of tea, Early broke the silence again, his voice devoid of emotion. "For some reason, though, I don't think the bed you've been in for the past 2 nights was all that lonely. Don't you think it's time to explain? Can you tell me what's been going on?" "Susan?" Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head, her hands covering her eyes. "Early, I love you," she cried. "This has nothing to do with you or us. Please try to understand. I felt like I had to do it." Early's eyes narrowed, his tone hardening. "Nothing to do with us? How can you say that? You betrayed me, Susan. How could that not have anything to do with us?" She looked at him desperately, her voice trembling. "I had to, Early. I was trying to repay John for what he did for me," Susan said quietly, her voice trembling. "It has nothing to do with how I feel about you. It's not connected to my love for you at all." Early remained seated, silently watching his wife as he slowly sipped his tea. Finally, he stood, walked to the kitchen and refilled his cup. Without turning to her, he asked, "Would you like anything?" She shook her head, refusing to meet his gaze. When he returned to his chair, he settled in, his expression unreadable. "Well, wife," he began, his voice cold and deliberate. "Tell me, why did you feel indebted to Snur? And why did you think repaying that debt meant breaking your wedding vows to me?" A sudden, painful thought struck him. "Did he blackmail you?" he asked sharply. "Was there some kind of threat involved when he helped with the Melos case?" "No. Oh no," Susan exclaimed, shaking her head vigorously. "He didn't do anything like that. John's a good man, a noble man. He only helped me because he wanted to, because he knew the mess wasn't my fault. He never asked for anything in return." Early's expression hardened further. "So he didn't ask. He was so noble that he didn't even hint that you should betray me? Then why did you volunteer? What am I missing here? Susan? This all sounds so vulgar." Susan's face contorted with frustration and anguish. "It wasn't like that. Keep telling you he deserved it. This wasn't about you or us. It had nothing to do with my love for you." Early's voice grew firmer, his words laced with disbelief. "Did I do something wrong, then? Was it some failure on my part that led to this?" Susan's voice rose as she nearly shouted. "No, I've told you this wasn't your fault. I needed to find some way to thank him for what he did for me. When he helped with Melos, he wasn't just helping me, he was helping both of us. Everything I did was for him, not for myself, and it had nothing to do with how I feel about you." After a brief pause, Early's voice softened, though it carried a sharp edge of pain. "Since you're so offended by how tasteless my description of your gratitude sounds, does that mean it was wonderful for you?" The silence that followed was deafening. Early leaned forward slightly, his voice low but intense. "Susan, do you remember how I always told you that I belonged to you? How I swore, time and time again, that I was entirely yours? And how many times did you promise me the same, that you belonged to me?" He paused, his tone growing heavier. "You said it so often, Susan, without me even asking. Do you remember how much that meant to me? Do you understand how deeply I believed it, how much I trusted in that?" Susan nodded weakly, tears spilling down her face. "Early," she whispered, "I do belong to you. I always have. This has nothing to do with us. Nothing to do with my love for you." Early shook his head, his tone shifting to one of despair. "Susan, how can you say that? How can you claim to love me while doing something so contradictory? You gave me what mattered most to me, yourself, and now you've given that to someone else. And the worst part..." He leaned back, his voice turning quieter and more hopeless. "You've made it clear that you don't even value it. You handed it over to a man who didn't ask for it, who didn't want it. By your own words, Susan, he didn't even suggest it. I can't help but wonder. Did you have to beg him to accept it?" Susan's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking violently. Through her tears, she managed to choke out, "It doesn't mean anything, Early. I'm still here. I still love you. Nothing has changed in me." Early's voice cracked as he replied, "Susan, everything changes us. Everything. You've just come back from spending 2 nights with another man, nights where you shared intimacy with someone else. Things that should only be shared with someone you love." His voice trembled as he asked, "How many nights, Susan? Was it just 2? Or were there more?" Susan didn't answer, her sobs growing heavier as she buried her face in her hands. After a long, agonizing silence, Early spoke again, his tone eerily calm. "And God help me, Susan, but I can't stop wondering. How many other men have deserved to be rewarded with what was supposed to belong only to me? You tell me that you're mine, and yet..." He trailed off, his words sinking into the air between them. Susan's body seemed to shrink under the weight of his words. Her shoulders slumped, her elbows rested on her knees, and her hair fell across her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. Long moments passed, the room heavy with silence except for her muffled cries. Outside, life continued undisturbed. The sun shone brightly, children played, and neighbors enjoyed the quiet of a sunny afternoon. But inside, the world felt darker, the air thick with grief and betrayal. The soft chime of the mantelpiece clock marked the arrival of noon, breaking the silence. Early's voice finally returned, quieter now, tinged with both love and despair. "Susan, I don't know where this is heading. I swear to you, I still love you just as much as I did on Sunday when I left for Los Angeles. But I don't know where we stand anymore. You keep telling me that your betrayal has nothing to do with me." Early's voice faltered, thick with emotion. "You don't understand what you've done. My trust in you is shattered, and I don't know how or if it can be rebuilt. I don't even know what you could do to earn it back." The silence between them hung heavy, suffocating. Then Early spoke again, his tone sharper, more resolute. "If you're implying that I should go out and cheat on you to even the score, let me stop you right there. If that's what you think, then this marriage is already over. First of all, if my fidelity means so little to you, it's just another sign of how little you value me. Secondly, 2 wrongs don't make a right. 2 wrongs only make things twice as bad." He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and placed the empty teacup on the mantel. Walking into the dining room, he pulled back the curtains to let the sunlight spill in, casting sharp contrasts between the bright, immaculate backyard and the dim, suffocating room behind him. He spoke again, his voice low and controlled, forcing her to strain to catch his words. "Susan," he began, pausing to gather his thoughts. "I want to shake you so hard your teeth rattle. I've never wanted to hurt anyone in my life, least of all my wife, my love. But right now, I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something I can't control." He exhaled sharply. "And meeting John Snur right now? That would be the worst idea imaginable. Especially since, by your own admission, it wasn't even his idea. You're telling me you seduced him." Susan made a small sound of protest, but he cut her off before she could say more. "Let me finish. You say it wasn't his idea, but now you've handed him something he didn't work for, didn't even ask for. And now that he's had a taste of that, of you, don't you think he's going to expect it again? Whatever you explain to him, he now knows you're easy for him to get along with. Maybe he doesn't believe you're available to everyone, but he certainly knows you're available to him." Susan tried to interject again, but Early kept going, his words gaining momentum. "You think this won't change things? Over time, he'll lose respect for you. He'll stop valuing you. That's how it works. And wife," he said, the word laced with bitterness, "if you and I want to salvage whatever's left of this marriage, we're going to have to face all of this head-on, hour by hour, day by day, week by week." He paused, taking a deep breath, his voice softening into something almost fragile. "But I don't even know if that's possible. Not right now. Not today. Any decisions we make will take time. Months, maybe even years, before we can feel anything close to comfortable with each other again." Turning back to face her, he continued, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Tonight, I'll sleep in the guest room. Tomorrow we'll replace our double bed with 2 smaller ones. One for each of us. If we both want this to work, we're going to have to rebuild from the ground up. Right now, I doubt you can handle what that will take. But this is the best I can offer you for now." He cast his eyes around the dim living room, feeling as though he were staring into a dark cave, a stark contrast to the sunlit backyard just beyond the glass doors. His voice cracked slightly as he added, "I'm willing to try, though. In the coming months, we'll talk. We'll figure out what marriage means to each of us. Maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to save this." His voice softened even further, the pain beneath the surface unmistakable. "Susan, I love you." With that, he turned, sliding the glass doors open and stepping into the courtyard. The warmth of the sunlight hit him, but it did little to ease the chill inside. As he closed the door behind him, he heard Susan's voice faintly through the glass.